I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to be configuring an output channel strip for your tracks. What exactly does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to be adding plugins to the output channel in order to make your track a little bit bigger, a little bit wider, a little bit more inflated. Now, before we go any further, let's be 100% clear. If you have the option to have your tracks professionally mastered, you should always take that opportunity. Mastering engineers have the most remarkable tools at their disposal, and because they're dedicated to the process of finalizing tracks, taking everything about your project and adding the nuance required to increase volume and frequency content and stereo width with a new discerning pair of ears at exactly the time when your project's coming to an end, that's a process that you should explore whenever you have that opportunity. But a lot of the time, what we're looking to do is to send our tracks out into the world, and we want them to feel like they're sort of competing with the other tracks that exist out there. And the truth of the matter is that quite frequently, if you put an unmastered mix or a track that doesn't have an output channel configured for it just out into the world and you compare it to other tracks that have been through that process, they're going to feel a bit smaller. They're not going to feel as loud, they're not going to feel as wide, they're not going to feel quite so exciting. So what we're going to do in this video is to explore a series of plugins that you can begin to use on your own tracks, not as a substitute for a full mastering solution, but to provide you with the tools required just to give your tracks that extra weight and power. So before we go any further, let's have a listen to the track that we're going to be working on. Okay, there we go. Now what I'm actually going to do is to put a loop round one section of the track, and I'm deliberately picking the bit where the mix is at its largest, because it sort of stands to reason that if we can get a sound or a configuration of output channels or output channel plugins that work here, probably it's going to work well elsewhere in the track as well. So we're just going to focus on this 8-bar section for now. So of course, it stands to reason that anything I put on the stereo output is going to affect the entire mix because every sound is passing through there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a plugin which actually we shouldn't need initially, but it's useful to have it in there as a first stage. And what I'm talking about here is the concept of working and starting with an EQ. Now normally when we EQ within Logic, we're looking at the channel EQ, but for mastering solutions it's well worth using the linear phase EQ instead, which looks exactly the same as the channel EQ, but what it's going to do is to preserve phase balance. So it's not going to start introducing phasing issues, and therefore it's perfectly tailored to kind of this output channel process. So why am I not immediately starting to make tone changes using this EQ when I'm starting to think about an output channel solution? Well, the reason for that is that at this point, there shouldn't be any need for me to start changing tone. If the track is too bright or if it's not bright enough, actually that's something I need to fix at the mix stage. The reason I've put it there is just in case some of the processes we add to this track later on suddenly have implications for tone. If straight away I need to be changing things to do with the tone, then maybe I need to go back to the mix and make those changes on a per instrument basis. So the linear phase EQ is waiting for me. If I need it, I'll come back to it. So what I've then got a chance to do is to start thinking about dynamics. What we tend to do when we're configuring an output channel track solution is that what we want to do is to just have everything feel dynamically a little bit tighter than it was before. And I've got two options here. I can either use Logic's compressor, or I can use the multi-band compressor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set both of these up. The multipressor within Logic is going to go on the second strip here, the second option available to me. I'll close it for now, and in fact I'm going to just bypass it. And what we're going to do instead is to start by looking at stereo compression. So why am I opening both of those plugins? Why am I not just using one or the other? Well, The concept of working with compression, again, we're always going to be using our ears and using those to judge whether or not we're improving the sound of the track that we're working on. And sometimes stereo compression is enough. It provides enough tools for us to produce this really coherent dynamic response within our tracks. And sometimes it's not, because what we've got is such delineation between the different frequency bands that we're working on that what we need to do is to apply different compression settings to the bass or to the mid-range or to the treble than across the entire track. So it's good to have both options available, but probably we're not going to need both of them one after the other. It'll be one or the other. So let's configure both and work out which one we like the sound of best. So we're going to start with stereo compression. The first thing I'm going to do is to turn off automatic gain makeup. I don't want Logic to be adding more volume for me. And now what I'm looking to do is to just begin to think a little bit what happens when I get this slightly punchy approach to working with compression. Now, as we know within Logic, we've got lots of different algorithms available to us, and it's up to us to decide which one we want to use. And I'm actually going to go with this vintage VCA algorithm to start with. And what I'm looking to do here is not to completely smash the dynamics of my track to pieces. Hopefully, again, if the mix balance is right, what I'm looking to do here is just to kind of glue the mix a little bit together. Remember, all of the frequency groups within this track are going to be arriving into this compressor, so they're all going to slightly meld together and glue together nicely if I get my settings right. So I'm going to start by setting a threshold point, looking at ratio as well, and I'm going to just press play and listen to a little bit of this, configure some settings, and then we'll talk about exactly what I've done and why I've done it. Okay, it's subtle, and the reason it's subtle is because I like the mix of my track. I'm not looking to completely reinvent the wheel here. So what have I done? Well, firstly, what I've done is to select a threshold point, which is providing up to about 3 decibels of gain reduction. And I'm seeing that every time this needle sort of responds to the track. Obviously, it's teaching me something important there as well, which is the main thing it's listening to is the kick drum, which has got the most energy in it. That's the thing that's making that needle move the most. And of course, from that base point, effectively, we're gluing the mix together by having the dynamics respond to that sound most of all. However, the reason why the effect is so subtle is because my ratio, the amount that I'm actually reducing dynamics above that point, is so small. I've selected a ratio here of about 1.8 to 1. So in other words, we're only just squeezing the dynamics a little bit above the threshold point. What I have done though is to switch off the automatic release time. I don't want Logic deciding that for me. And what I've done is to configure an attack time and a release time that feels natural to me. Now remember, the attack time is the speed at which the compressor responds every time the threshold point is exceeded. So how quickly it's going to start smashing those dynamics down a little bit or responding to the signals that are coming in above the threshold point, whereas the release time controls how quickly it responds. And because there is so much activity in this track, it's all of these sounds playing together, what I want is this kind of nice natural release time, but an attack time that's quite punchy and responding quite nicely and quite quickly to the track. So those are the settings that I've gone for, and remember the first thing we did was to switch off automatic gain. Now, let's bypass the stereo compressor, and instead let's introduce the multipressor instead, and we'll open this up and begin to see what difference we get when we approach the concept of dynamics, but on a per frequency basis. So what I've got a chance to do here is to start thinking a little bit about the way that I'd like dynamics to respond, but in different frequency areas. And you can see that the multi-band compressor allows me to break the signal down into 4 separate bands. So this is the bass area, this is low mid-range, this is upper mid-range, and this is sort of a super high treble. And obviously I say that that's what those bands are. I have a chance to decide where they're going to go simply by moving the relationships around between these bands so that I can either make them bass, low mid-range, upper mid-range and treble, or I can say, actually, you know what, the area that I really need to be focusing on is by splitting the treble band into 2 separate bits, because that's where there's information that needs configuring independently. So what I've got a chance to do here now is to think a little bit about my independent compressor threshold on a per band basis. And to take an example, what I have a chance to do, let's decide that what I want to do is to focus on band number 3. I've just soloed that for a moment so we can hear just the frequency content that exists within that band. So you can see that what I've done first of all is to draw the boundaries around that band in the place that I want them to go, and you can also see that what I've done is to bring the compressor threshold into the sort of area where those frequencies are active. And what I've then got a chance to do is to choose a ratio for them. So exactly the same thing that we were doing within the stereo compressor, but this time just around a particular group of frequencies. What I've also got is attack and release times as I had before, and I'm in a position to sort of configure those so that they sound natural. So having looked at that approach for just one band, what we can start doing is coming out of solo mode. I don't want to go through each band individually. What I want to be doing is taking a more sort of holistic approach to thinking about the way that we can approach dynamics. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes maybe configuring some settings here on a per frequency basis within the multi-band compressor. Okay, now obviously it goes without saying that this process, you could spend an hour just going through each individual band, choosing individual sort of threshold points, ratios, attack and release times for each individual one. So we're absolutely sprinting through this process, and it's really important that you really take your time and continue to go through that process of bypassing the effect, putting it back in, seeing whether or not you prefer what you had to what you have, and really thinking about this on a per band basis. But what you can see is that I've gone through very quickly and selected a threshold point for each band of the compressor, a ratio for each one as well, and just begun to think a little bit about attack and release times as well. And what you can see is that when I click on an individual line here, I have a chance to increase or decrease the gain for each individual band. So if I suddenly get the bass end of the mix sounding a little bit tighter from a dynamic response, and I then want to increase the volume of that entire band, I can do that here as well. So that's a sort of brief look at the multi-band compressor. What I'm going to do is, actually for now, I'm going to bypass that. We'll again compare that in a moment within the context of our track overall between the compressor and the multi-band compressor, but we're going to move on and look at another plugin which is sort of turns up at the output stage quite regularly, and that's the concept of stereo spread. Now we're going to find this within the imaging folder. And what this allows us to do is to increase the stereo footprint of the track that we're working on. Now I'll make that a little larger. What does this plugin actually show me? Well, firstly, what it's doing is it's showing me the band of frequencies that I can choose to make wider. In other words, I can spread them from the left-hand side of the mix, which is shown up here, to the right-hand side of the mix, which is shown down here. And what I have a chance to do is to decide which frequency area I want to begin to sort of disperse from left to right. Now, I need to be really careful. You may already know that the sort of punch and power that comes from a mix tends to come from a really solid low end. And if I start stereo spreading out frequencies that include the ultra low kick drum and bass frequencies, actually rather than my mix sounding more exciting, it's going to start sounding completely incoherent. So what I have a chance to do is to select the frequency areas that actually I might want to start thinking about spreading. And the first thing I'm going to do is to move up the lower band to about 550 Hertz, leaving all of the bass alone so that its kind of stereo image is as intact as it was before. And if I want to, I can also rein in ultra high frequency content as well, sort of concentrating the stereo spread around a much narrower group of frequencies. Now, what you can also see is that I have control over how much stereo spread I'm going to put in within that new frequency range. Do I want a complete sort of dispersion of all of those frequencies, or do I again want to be a little bit more cautious than that? And I can do that at both ends of the frequency spectrum. I can decide what percentage of spread I want between those different frequency bands. And what I'm going to do is to introduce this probably slowly from the low end and maybe be a little bit more generous at the top end. And probably what we're going to do is to end up with something along these lines where we're just beginning to spread the top end a little bit more than the bottom. But just so we can hear that really clearly, to start with, what I'll do is I'll open up both bands really wide and we'll hear the difference between a stereo spread version of our track and one that maintains the sort of stereo mix that we've got within the main mix before this output channel processing. So let's start bypassed and we'll introduce it after one playthrough. Okay, so you can hear that's a massive difference, too much in fact. It sort of sounds exciting in a way, but what we're losing is kind of this coherence that we had before. So again, let's be cautious. What I'm going to do is to introduce a little bit of this technique by massively reducing the sort of lower level of spread frequencies and also significantly reining in the top end instead. And hopefully, with any luck, what we might get in this kind of mid-range area is just a little bit more widening, a little bit more excitement without it sort of going crazy. Okay, that's feeling much better to me. We get this little lift that comes from a slightly wider stereo picture without the kind of massive spread that we had before. Okay, so what we're also going to do is to introduce probably the most important processor in the context of changing the makeup of the way that our sort of output channel feels compared to the original, which is to introduce the adaptive limiter. Now, this is Logic's kind of finalizing processor. What this allows me to do is to begin to think about adding volume to my track, but keeping what we call a ceiling in place to make sure that the volume isn't just simply increased, it's limited, it's reduced again in terms of its sort of dynamic response. But what we're doing this time is trying to make sure that we're increasing the overall volume of our track. Now, the way that that works is that we first of all have what's called a straightforward gain increase. We have a chance to ask our track to get up to a certain amount louder. What that's going to mean is that for the quieter moments in between the main individual hits within our track, we can turn volume up by whatever value I select here. So if I select 3 decibels, if there is 3 dB of headroom at any moment in a track, Logic knows that it can increase volume by up to that much. Volume is also increased for moments which don't have that much headroom, but this is an intelligent processor. So what it's not going to do is to force things into distortion. It's simply going to say, okay, I've got this much volume I can add at this given moment, and that's what it's going to do. This is what's called a look-ahead processor, because it's going to look into the file and make intelligent decisions about how much volume it adds. Here is our output ceiling. This gives us a chance to set the maximum volume that Logic will allow us to go to. And what I'm going to do is to take 1/10 of a decibel off that to set that at minus 0.1 dB. And here is our look ahead control. This allows us to ask Logic or to set a point for how far into the file the processor will look in order to make those decisions for us. The adaptive limiter is going to, once you put it into your track, it's going to massively introduce latency into your projects. So what I mean by that is that you'll find that if you suddenly decide you want to add a new instrument, you'll find that when you play a note, there's a huge audible delay between you playing the note and it actually playing back through your speakers. And that's because we've introduced this look-ahead processor. Logic is taking its time to buffer the information in order to produce the sound that the adaptive limiter produces. So this is definitely a processor only to introduce right at the last minute. But what it's going to do, as I say, is to increase volume. So again, let's just punch this in. I'm going to put a maximum of 4 decibels worth of gain. I'm going to turn it off. We'll hear the mix through the linear EQ, through the stereo compressor, through the stereo spread, not yet through the adaptive limiter, and I'll put it in as we play back. Okay, and there's obviously a significant difference. We get this much, much louder mix. Now remember, the first plugin we put in place was our linear phase EQ. And it's the introduction of a processor like the adaptive limiter that might make you think, does the track now feel a bit bassy or a little bit bright? This might be the processor that makes you just appreciate the frequency content of your track in a slightly different way, because all of these processes between the original mix file and now all of these processes that we've put in place since might have implications for frequency content. So if you suddenly think, okay, actually I could use a little bit more bass or a little bit less, or a little bit more treble or a little bit less, here's your opportunity to go back to the linear EQ and make those adjustments. And for me, we've got a slightly fizzier mix now than I would like. So what I'm going to do is to come back into here and just very slightly attenuate frequencies in and around where the hi-hats are playing. Let's just have a listen to that. This is an incredibly subtle change. Okay, that's working a little bit better for me, just this very, very sort of subtle edit in this kind of frequency area. And again, just keep A-Bing your mixes. In fact, when you're going through this process, I strongly advise you make some decisions, go away, make a cup of tea, come back, try again. You'll constantly find that these tiny, subtle little moments will feel much more significant when you come back having had a break. Just keep making these little value judgments. It'd be quite interesting, actually, just at this stage, to put back in the multipressor rather than the stereo compressor to see how that feels in the context of this track. Okay, interesting to compare the two. You can decide which one you prefer. So within this video, what we've done is we've begun to think about creating an output channel solution. Now remember, this isn't a substitute for the mastering process, but what it is going to give you is an opportunity to create a slightly more inflated, sort of ready for sharing version of your mix. And what we've done is to look at linear phase EQ. We've looked at the idea of creating stereo compression and multi-band compression at the output stage. We've explored the idea of stereo spreading or stereo width enhancement, and we've looked at the adaptive limiter and the extra volume we get through that processor. So when you're trying to configure a mix, you've gone through the mix stage and you're thinking about, okay, I'd like to just have this mix feel like it's got a slightly more inflated sort of footprint. This is a series of processes that you can go through.